Welcome to Khanversations. This is Muqtedar Khan, your host, and today I have with me a very distinguished scholar, a very well-known economist, Dr. Ashoka Mody, who is the author of this book, India is Broken, a rather counterintuitive title, which is very intriguing. And he's here to talk to us about why he thinks India is weak or broken, both in the economic arena as well as political arena. So this book is a history of India's developmental path that it has taken since independence, and he points out to certain structural weaknesses in the decisions that our founding fathers and our leaders have taken over the years when it comes to economic macro policy, as well as some decisions about democracy. And so this is a timely book, and I'm extremely happy that Professor Mody is with us today. But before I turn to him, please subscribe to Khanversations, make sure you like the video, press the bell icon, and please share this as widely as possible with all your friends, especially in India. Dr. Mody, welcome to Khanversations.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
You're very well known, but I would just give a brief bio. Professor Mody did his bachelor's in electronics engineering from IIT Madras. There are two electronics engineers on this show at the moment. And then he went and did his master's in economics and his PhD from Boston University in economics. He spent several years with WorldBank and then IMF, and now he's a professor, a distinguished professor of practice at the Princeton University, one of the top Ivy League schools in the country. Professor Mody, let me start with this whole idea. We are at a moment where people in the Indian diaspora, as well as people in India, are talking about how this is India's moment, and the fact that India is now the fifth biggest economy, and I think by the time this interview is over, it might become the third biggest economy. And India has just crossed $750 billion in exports, is about to reach $1 trillion. So there's a lot of excitement, and there are genuine reasons. 40% of the country is below 25%.
What was that statistic? 40% of the country is what?
Below 25 years in age. So it says that with education and talent, we will have a tremendous workforce, unlike, say, China and other Western countries, where they're getting older people because of better healthcare and therefore a burden on the state. And also this fact that the world is now turning to look at India. Everybody wants to trade with India, even trade in rupees. So there's all this hype going on about how India is becoming an economic superpower and also a geopolitical superpower. And boom, from left field, we get this book which says, India is broken. How is India broken, Professor Mody?
Okay, so the India is broken theme essentially centers around jobs in the economics arena, and it centers around the erosion of social norms and public accountability in the political arena. And the book is a history. And in the preface of the book, I say, this is a history to inform the present. The reason I've written a history rather than just a contemporary account of jobs and social norms is to document and tell the story of how the Indian economy has never been able to supply jobs to large portions of its working age population. And that this is a chronic and integral failure. It is not something that has happened yesterday or today. At the same time, as the stresses on people have grown, the political masters have responded by increasingly short-term policy stances, which have got associated very from the very earliest times, initially with your run-of-the-mill corruption, transformed under Mrs. Gandhi into bringing in more criminally charged politicians, and the two have moved in parallel. India has never been able to make up the deficit in jobs, and India has continuously suffered from an erosion of social norms and public accountability. And the reason to use the word broken is this historical perspective that these are two problems we do not seem to be able to solve. And because we are not able to solve them, I feel that we have a fundamental problem. Let me just say one last thing before I turn it back to you. You gave a lot of statistics which are very heartwarming. I have no reason to quarrel with them. But take the particular statistic that you just gave of 40% of the population is less than 25 years old. True. But the question is, do we have the jobs to give them? India has had this demographic dividend from day one, from 1947. India has always had young people coming onto the job market in the millions. It increased to about 10 or 12 million at one point. Even now, something of the order of 7 to 9 million people come into the job market every year. But just as a one statistic that will resonate, I hope, with your audience, is that between 2012 and 2022, in this last 10-year period, the Indian economy did not generate any jobs. This at a time when there were lots of people coming in onto the job market. By my estimation, India needs to create 200 million jobs over the next 10 years from zero in the previous 10 years. So while all the very glamorous stuff that you talk about is true, brand name stores are opening in India and such like, there is the narrative that you describe is essentially a narrative of Indians who live first world lives, echoed by an international counterpart of that elite.
From a purely intellectual perspective, you have basically taken one very interesting digression. And you say in your book that you have not used GDP growth as a measure of economic policy success, but rather than that, you have looked at other criteria. One is unemployment. The other is how sustainable this growth is. You have shown great concern for the environment. But you also talk about that India is not only suffering from unemployment. And this morning, I checked with all the developing countries, the countries that India is competing with. All the countries' unemployment rates are between 3.5 to 5, except France, which is 7.2. And India, in just 2023, has gone from 7.4 in January to 7.8 in February to 8.8% unemployment in April. So yes, the number is there, but not many people talk about it. But you also talk about underemployment, which kind of hides and conceals the unemployment and, shall we say, makes it look smaller than it actually is. So what do you mean by underemployment?
Okay. So again, you've said many things. Let me just take them one at a time. Why the focus on jobs? So President Biden, in his latest State of the Union address, used the word jobs 45 times. He never used the word GDP growth.
Yeah.
And there's a reason for that. Jobs is where the respect and dignity of people lies. Jobs is where people feel a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose. GDP growth is a mysterious number that can be pumped up by environmental degradation. You set up a petrochemical plant. That petrochemical plant produces a lot of GDP. It employs very few people. It discharges effluent into the rivers. And you get GDP out of that. But what does it do for these millions of people who are coming out into the job market? So both because GDP conceals vast inequalities, does not create jobs, and on the other hand, also has an enormously degrading effect on the environment. And I hope we will get an opportunity to talk about that, but sticking to the jobs for a moment, this is why the focus on jobs, because of the respect and dignity. Now, unemployment rate of 8% or 7% or 6%, in some sense is not such a big deal. Okay, so 3% and 7%, yes, maybe that's high, but really, as you quite rightly have read the book, the big problem is underemployment. So let me give you an example. Some years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, my mother sent me to this local Saket market to buy a shampoo. And I enter the store and there is a lady sitting over there and everyone calls her Auntie Ji. And she looks younger than me, but I also call her Auntie Ji. Auntie Ji, mere ko shampoo chahiye. I'd like a shampoo. And Auntie Ji then calls out, Are oh Ramu, beta inko shampoo dikha de. So she calls out to this little fellow Ramu who comes scampering from the back, and then he produces 2 shampoos from a shelf there. And then Ramu scampers back, probably to see cricket in the back room somewhere. I pay Auntie Ji and I leave. I'm the only customer, and who knows how many customers she gets in a day. And I ask my students the question, are Auntie Ji and Ramu employed? Technically, they are employed. But they spend the vast portion of their day effectively unemployed. So that is what is underemployment. I've given you one graphic example. The bulk of the underemployment is in agriculture, where there are short seasons for agricultural production. Over the rest of the seasons, people don't have any work. Rural employment other than agriculture has grown slowly. Essentially, what happens is that people engage in work-sharing arrangements to give themselves some sense that they are doing something. Hence, the word time pass has become part of the Indian lexicon. You don't pass your time, you do time pass. And so the language itself has evolved to incorporate this notion of underemployment. And that is why, for most people, life is a struggle. We can quibble about data on poverty and so on. But the point is that if you look at the daily lives of people, this is why I say that to understand India, we have to look at the lived reality. And that lived reality, front and center, the heart of it is jobs. And then you can look at the quality of education, the quality of healthcare, most importantly, in some sense, most centrally, the broken judicial system, where the number of under trials in the Indian prison system is increased. One statistic that not many people are aware of, that 77% of the prison population is under trial. What does that mean? They've been arrested, they've not been granted bail, and they're waiting to be tried. Many of them are in jail for longer periods than they would have if they had been convicted of the crime they were alleged to have alleged to have committed. The environmental degradation, every river in India is dying. So yes, I can go to a Louis Vuitton store in Saket Market also. I know that. And I can buy a $400 Adidas shoe. I know that. And I know that Nita Ambani can have a cultural center where she brings in Gigi Haddad from the Palestinian model. But that's a different world. That's the world of maybe 30, 40 million Indians. We need to go beyond that to understand what the reality is. And that reality is what I'm trying to describe in the book.
You know, when I was reading that part where you talk about the word time pass, I realized that there was actually a concept like that called jhak marna, which in Persian actually means fishing. So basically, you are doing nothing while you are waiting to catch fish. I wonder why people don't talk about productivity when we talk about individuals. So when in India right now, the euphoria is about GDP, but not per capita GDP. Because that really looks very low compared to most developed countries. It's around 2,500 or something. But I wonder this idea of underemployment can be captured if you have a measure of productivity. But there is something that you made while I was looking at the data on unemployment. I found something very interesting that in India right now, unemployment is higher in the urban centers than in the rural areas. And I'm thinking it is because once you don't have a job in the gaon, you go to the shahar. But if you don't have a job in the city, you are not going to the villages looking for jobs. That's why a lot of unemployed people. But you make a remarkable observation in the book in which you say that Indian cities have not become engines of growth. And that I would like you to talk a little bit more about that, what you had in mind, because you were comparing India's growth patterns with Japan and South Korea and even Vietnam. So what are cities in those highly developed countries in Asia doing, have done, say, because by 1970s, 1960s, India was on par with these countries, and now they are so far ahead. So what do you mean when you say that Indian cities have not become engines of growth and development?
So in urban economists will tell us that cities are such dynamic economic centers because they create something called agglomeration economies. I like to locate near you because you are able to then supply me and I'm able to supply you. As Alfred Marshall wrote almost 100 odd years ago, that you have clusters, a textile cluster, a pottery cluster, a cluster for making bicycle parts, as was the case in Japan for a very long time. And what happens in these clusters is that people talk to each other. As Marshall says, it's as if in the air, the ideas are in the air. And this is what economists call agglomeration economies. A modern form of agglomeration economies is Silicon Valley. But cities have mini Silicon Valleys centered around garments or shoes or bicycles. And that is the dynamic part of a city, which then creates an upsurge of growth eventually. Indian urbanization is very peculiar. If you look at the official statistics, India is still very unurbanized. Only about 30% of the population lives in urban centers. But then if you look at satellite images, the density of population is significantly high beyond what are officially called urban centers. What has happened? That villages have grown big on the urban periphery And those big villages have population density characteristics of urban areas, but they do not have the facilities. They do not have the normal accoutrements of cities. And so people are traveling long distances. People have poor housing, continue to have poor sanitation, effluent discharges. And now, in the last 25 years, one major plague has hit upon cities, which is that we have constructed over water bodies. So take, for example, the city of Bangalore. Bangalore had something like 800 odd lakes, maybe 25 years ago. Virtually all of them have disappeared because there is construction on top of them. Why is that such a terrible problem? It's a terrible problem for at least two reasons. One is that when rainwater falls, it does not go into the water bodies to replenish the groundwater. Hence, the continual stress on groundwater in India. And the second is because the water doesn't have to go anywhere and has no place to go, you get flooding, even with minor rain. And you've seen the stories of the Bangalore flood recently, and you've seen the stories of the Chennai flood in 2015. It happens in Bombay, it happens in Delhi, it happens in every Indian city. So there is a chaotic urbanization that is occurring, but it is not a urbanization geared to productivity growth, which is what a city is supposed to do.
Professor, my next question is, I want to preface it with an experience I had playing leg spin for the first time. And I had a very high opinion of my batting skills when I actually played a really good leg spinner. And I just said, Gola kahan hai? I just couldn't figure it out where it was coming from, where it was going. I was looking totally foolish at the crease. And the guy was enjoying it. And rather than making me out, he made me look like a fool for quite a while, then got me out. I had the same feeling when I read something that you wrote in this book, and you insist on it and you argue quite a bit. One of the biggest things that's been going around about India's story, India's moment, is India's CEO of every major IT company is an Indian now. Even YouTube now is somebody called Neil, who's just taken over as CEO. They say that 2/3 of the engineers in Silicon Valley are from India now, or at least 33%. Yeah, I think 1/3 are from India. There wouldn't be no Silicon without India. So India is providing engineers, providing doctors, providing MBAs to the rest of the world. The Gulf is managed by Indians, and so much of the West is. Now we are also ruling, we have prime ministers and we have vice presidents. And you make the argument that one of India's failures has been providing good education. And you have come hard on this particular aspect, especially when you compared India with Korea and Japan, and says India has failed to invest in its education. And I want to understand what you mean by that.
So education to assess education, we need to look at least at three different statistics. Enrollment, school enrollment. So India achieved nearly universal primary school enrollment sometime in the 1990s. Just as a point of comparison, the Koreans and Taiwanese achieved that sometime in the 60s. And the achievement of nearly universal primary education in these East Asian advanced economies was closely associated with the surge in manufactured exports from these countries. India did not achieve it till in the 90s. Having achieved it, then two problems arose. One is that in 5th grade, in 8th or 9th, and again in about 11th grade, there are significant dropouts. Why is that? That's largely because Although enrolled in primary school, children get a very poor quality education. So varieties of studies done domestically, both official and unofficial, will tell you that a fifth grade student struggles to do second grade reading. A fifth grade student struggles to do simple division. The result is that as the kids become older, that gap, that deficit increases. So by 8th or 9th grade, the struggle becomes even larger. Again, I'll give you an example. After my mother passed away, just before the onset of COVID, I occasionally tutor a little girl who my mother used to tutor. And she was bringing to me problems in trigonometry and calculus. And I'm looking at her, and she is struggling to do basic operations in math and algebra. So I asked her one day, I said, what does the teacher do in class? So if you don't mind, I'll revert to Hindi for 1 second.
Sure,
And she said
sure.
that मैम 10 मिनट तो लेट आती हैं, लेट आने के बाद वो इंटरनेट खोलने में 10 मिनट और लगा देती हैं, और उसके बाद 15-20 मिनट पढ़ाती हैं और फिर चली जाती हैं. और मैंने कहा फिर what do the other kids do? She says नहीं, वो अगर मॉनिटर अपनी कॉपी दे देती है, उसमें हम कॉपी कर लेते हैं तो उसके लिए 10 मार्क मिल जाते हैं. So essentially, this is a Delhi school, much wanted Delhi school. And the quality of teaching has adapted to the fact that the children are unprepared. Yes, I know that there are very brilliant Indians. I know that there are IITs. As you pointed out, I'm a product of an IIT. My wife is a product of an IIT. We have benefited from that brand naming and that education. But ask yourself the question, how many of the children go through that process? Look at Punjab, for example. Punjab, there are these dozens of garbage colleges which produce engineering degrees. And the kids come out of those thinking that they'll go to get a job, and they're offered 10,000 or 15,000 rupees for an education for which they have spent 10-15 lakhs. And there is sort of a desperation because the vast bulk of the education is so poor quality that the fact that we have got all these very brilliant people in Silicon Valley is interesting and maybe important. And maybe there will come a time when most of our children have that quality of education. But what I can say is we are so far from that. And just to conclude, while we are struggling with these sort of fundamentals, take the Vietnamese. So there is something called the pizza test. It's an international test organized by implemented by the OECD, which tests students, I think, in 8th grade. 2015, Vietnam was near the top. In other words, Vietnamese kids did better or on par with French kids. India entered this assessment process in 2012, ranked near the bottom or virtually at the bottom, dropped out and has not re-entered. So, as I say in the book, education is like running a Red Queen race. You need to run twice as fast as you can to stay in the same place. In the 60s and even early 70s, good primary education was enough. Now, as the technologies are advancing, you need secondary education. And as they advance even further, you need good college education. We are failing to provide reasonable education at all levels, resulting in dropouts and frustrated graduates.
You know, when we talk about all these CEOs, etc., we often forget that they usually are MS or MBA from Stanford. That part we often forget when we just talk about that. I want to continue on this theme of unemployment. And one of the statistics that is quite shocking about India's job market. And I'm also shocked by how little of that discussion we see in India. In fact, actually, NPR had a show on this. When I was looking at the numbers, I discovered that NPR in the US covered that issue. Is the declining employment of women in India. So if you look at 2005, it was about 26%, 21% unemployment. Now it's about 26%. And there has been a steady decline since 2005 of women's employment, even though educational indicators are going up, families have become smaller, women have more opportunities and acceptance to go out there and be creative and work. But it is quite perplexing for a so rapidly developing country to find less and less women in the workplace. And I don't know how to understand that. Is that an indication of public policy or culture? I don't understand. Is it some new culture that women don't want to work, or are there no jobs? And it's not a COVID effect. In the US, yes, women lost jobs first because of COVID. But in India, the decline you can see from 2005 onwards.
So, as I tell my students, Khansa, there are two indicators of economic progress, two correlates of economic progress, which have been correlates since the Industrial Revolution 350 years ago. There is no country in the world, no country historically known that has made progress without making significant dent in these two indicators. They are good education and bringing women into the workforce. So when you strip everything away and you ask about India's future, it is in these two indicators, education and women in the workforce, that we have failed. We have failed for 75 years. That process on the women's participation has accelerated, as you quite rightly say, in around 2004 or 2005. And as you have also probably seen, this is a very central theme of my book. Now, what are the reasons behind that? There is a fundamental reason, which is the lack of jobs. So when there is a lack of jobs, men tend to get some priority, and women then stay back. The percentages that you talked about are the women's participation in the workforce. So the way labor statistics are computed is that if you say, I am looking for a job, you're part of the labor force. If you're looking for a job and you don't have a job, you're considered unemployed.
Yeah.
But if you are so discouraged that the likelihood that you will get a job is so low, you tell the enumerator, nahi, main kaam nahi karti hu, I don't work, and I have no interest in looking for a job. That is the category of people who has increased. Women who are discouraged from even saying that they are looking for work. Now, behind that lies yet another set of factors. What happened in the early 2000s was agricultural mechanization made women's tasks, took away a lot of women's tasks. For example, in weeding, the new weeding technologies made it such that the need for women who would do weeding reduced. There was a second factor, and this is now this is where the social norms and public accountability issue comes up. There is a significant degree of violence, both in private and public spaces in India. And there are sort of what I would say, the urban environments are still very hostile to women. So where there is a risk that, a bus ride is not very safe, or going out at a certain times of the day is not very safe, the social norms will tell you, don't go out. Just stay away from that. So the combination of a certain degree of mechanization in agriculture, probably increasing also in industry, the social violence, these are the primary factors why women say, yeah, we are not looking for work.
In the US, we have something called the misery index, right? If you look at unemployment and inflation, you add it up, and if it is more than 10%, then it's guaranteed that the incumbent will lose, especially in presidential elections, etc. I look at India's misery index. It has definitely been consistently above 10 for the last 15, 16 years. Unemployment and inflation have been both quite reasonably high. But people seem to vote for the same political parties. If there's so much unemployment and so much of berozgari, and it's affecting close to 50, 60 million people without jobs and even more underemployed, why isn't there widespread disenchantment in the public? Why are they happy with, approval ratings of the government of Prime Minister Modi in the 70s or more, supposedly the most popular prime minister in the world? How do we explain this disconnect between economic realities and political preferences?
Look, this is where sort of the rubber hits the road. So there are three different reasons. When I started doing this research, by the time when I was writing the last the chapters on Mrs. Gandhi, I asked myself this very same question. What you're calling the misery index was very high at the time, as it is now. And the question I asked myself is, why wasn't there a social revolution? And there was one answer that popped out relatively quickly once you asked the question. So, for example, what happened around that time was there was this Naxalite rebellion in Bengal, in the Naxalbari district. How did Mrs. Gandhi deal with it? She applied the full coercive power of the state in suppressing that rebellion. She employed initially the police, and then increasingly the army. And then when that Naxalite movement moved to the cities, the police used a device that has ever since been known as encounters, where the police will kill people claiming that they were acting in self-defense. Encounters is also a very interesting word, by the way. Today, you don't get killed in an encounter. You get encountered. So just like time passed, encountered has become part of the Indian lexicon. And encounters then periodically recur. And through the mafia in Mumbai in the 90s, the suppression of the rebellion in Punjab, the continued suppression of Naxalites in the Adivasi areas in Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand. So the coercive power of the state through police and armed forces, plus the use of preventive detention laws, is a very strong dampener on attempted coalitions to protest against the state. A second feature that has arisen is a move, and this is less well documented, a move of many such frustrated individuals into criminal activities. Sand mining is a very major criminal activity. Drug trade in more recent period. It's not documented well for India, but it's very well documented in many contexts where youth have a high probability of unemployment. They will move into criminal activities. And a third, which may now be the most, in some ways, the most important, is, for example, the attraction of the ideology people call Hindutva. So I don't know if you saw the documentary which was shortlisted for the Oscars, not this year, but last year, Writing with Fire. Writing with Fire is about a Hindi news portal called Khabar Lahariya, based in Bundelkhand in Uttar Pradesh. And the chief reporter, a woman by the name Meera, interviews a young man who is a leader of one of these, I think Hindu Yuva Vahini or Bajrang Dal, I forget which one of these. And she asks him, "Aapka vikas ke bare mein kya vichar hai? What do you think of development? Or how do you think of development?" And so this man goes into a reflection and says, "Gau raksha karni chahiye. You need to protect the cow." So Meera is at this point trying to suppress a smile because she realizes the answer is very orthogonal to what she was expecting. But she has the presence of mind to say, and how would protecting the cow enhance development? To which he replies, "Dekhiye, gav raksha hamara dharma hai. It is our duty, it's our obligation. And if we do our duty and obligation, development will follow automatically." So there is a seduction of a nationalist ideology, which is also drawing in a lot of young people and creating a mindset that is diverting them from thinking about long-term economic development processes and the damage that they suffer from that.
You know, you probably know Raghuram Rajan, the former RBI director, and he's a professor now in University of Chicago. He kind of created some noise a couple of weeks ago when he talked about how India was returning to the Hindu rate of growth, implying 4 to 5% or less even. So while everybody's talking about how India's GDP growth is going to be 6%, etc., he pointed out that if you look at the last 2 quarters and stuff, India's growth rate has actually declined, even though the hype continues about it. In fact, even you tweeted about it today, that China has now suddenly recovered and is probably this quarter, the first quarter in 2023, China's growth rate is actually, I think, higher than India's. India is 4.1 and China is 4.5. So I wanted to ask you as to, in the long term, looking at in the near 10, 15 years into the near future, with globalization receding and the advantages that China had in its rapid growth in the 80s, 90s, and this century, India may not experience that kind of international support for rapid growth that China enjoyed. So with focus so much on external GDP, export-driven GDP growth, etc., do you think that these structural flaws of bad education, inability to create jobs — I think the job deficit is over 100 million right now in India — do you see that this would be addressed, or do you think they will continue as a chronic problem?
Look, again, your questions are laden with lots of ideas. Let me just say one thing on the growth rate. Having been a professional GDP forecaster myself at the IMF for 10 or 11 years, the way GDP forecasts are done typically is that an economist will look at the past 10 years, look at the average, strip out all the jargon, all kinds of filters and so on, but essentially look at the average and say, yeah, pretty much things will happen as the average has been in the last 10 years. Mm-hmm. That's more or less how people do forecasting.
Yeah.
Okay? But the right way to do it is to ask, does that average of the past 10 years apply today? Now, in the quarters before COVID, Indian GDP growth, this is before COVID hit, Indian GDP growth was rapidly slowing down and had reached something of the order of 3.5%. That rapid slowdown was for a reason. India was not benefiting from world trade. India did not have any boost from the finance and construction bubble within which it had lived for 10, 15 years. And the sources of growth had essentially evaporated. Remember, India remains a deeply uncompetitive economy. There are islands of extreme excellence, but broadly, it is a hugely uncompetitive economy. The recent growth rates, high growth rates that people talk about, are essentially a yo-yoing in the post-COVID period. If you fall very sharply, you're likely to rise sharply. What people are doing is taking the periods of rise and extrapolating from them into the future. But as Raghu quite rightly points out, if you take the average over the last 3 years, from the onset of COVID to the present, again, the growth rate is about 3.5%. So before COVID, during COVID, Indian GDP growth has been around 3.5%. So when Raghu says that Indian GDP growth is going to be around 3.5%, I cannot quarrel with that. That number is a reasonable number to predict. Therefore, I am not sure where this rara about rapid growth is coming. And remember, I've also mentioned to you somewhat forcefully that I don't really care about GDP growth, because even in good times when GDP has grown rapidly, it has not created jobs, it has caused environmental destruction, it has not had any bearing on improvements in education and health and so on. What I'm saying to you now is that even GDP growth as a metric of success is likely to disappoint us over the coming years. And the broader pathologies that you and I have discussed over the last hour or so, they will therefore only deepen.
This is my last question to you, Professor. You've been so patiently answering this and so honestly and candidly. And I really feel that everybody who cares about India's economy should read this book. I will post a link to the Amazon page of the book here. I will also post a link to the Amazon page in India's Amazon. So please get a copy of the book, read it. The Foreign Affairs Journal has a very good review that came out just this week, Council on Foreign Relations. I will also post a link to that. Professor Mody himself has written a couple of short articles that summarize some of his arguments. I will post a link to that also. So do look at the description of the video below for these important links. So Professor Mody, my last question to you. If by any chance India's economists and policymakers were listening to you, what would be the most important thing you would recommend they focus on, say, for the next 4 to 5 years?
So one of the criticisms of the book, which I tried to deflect people from, but it's not easy to do so, is okay, so what should we do? Okay.
Mhm.
And my answer is it's not what we should do. What we know everything we should do. We need to educate our kids. We need to improve our healthcare system. We need to repair our judicial system. We need to clean up our rivers. We need to clean up our air. The problem is, why don't we do the things we need to do? And this is why I keep coming back to social norms and public accountability. I'll give you one last metaphor.
Mhm.
There is a garbage pile, garbage dump outside Delhi in Ghazipur. There are three of them, but let me take the Ghazipur one. And the Ghazipur landfill every now and then catches fire. You can take a report into 2022 or 2023, and you will see some report says the Ghazipur landfill is on fire. So I did a little bit of a investigation. I said, when did the Ghazipur landfill first catch fire? I'm going to ask you a question. Can you guess when the Ghazipur landfill first caught fire?
Probably when it was established. I don't know when.
In 1992.
Wow.
In 1992, there is a Reuters report which talks about the Ghazipur landfill being on fire. You can take that paragraph from 1992 and you can put it in a report in 2022, and you will not know the difference.
That's 40 years ago.
Is it
30,
40 or is it 30?
30 years.
30, yeah. You can do the same for the Yamuna, the cleaning of the Yamuna. The cleaning of the Yamuna is documented at least from the early 80s. The problems of Yamuna pollution that existed in the 80s exist today, maybe in more grievous form. We know the solutions. We know what to do, but we don't do it because the system of norms and accountability is broken. Hence, when people ask me, what should we do? I say that we have to begin with understanding how to repair norms and accountability. And for that reason, I say that the only public policy way we know how to do this, as distinct from exhorting people, is by creating a method of decentralized governance, where the governance is where the people who are ruled and their rulers are in relative proximity. So as a scholar yourself, you will know of Alexei de Tocqueville, who talked about community, the importance of community organizations and community governance in the 1800s. Robert Putnam has talked about that in the context of the United States and in Italy. Whatever evidence we have is that where we can make decentralized governance work better, accountability increases, because those who are governing become more responsive to the needs of the people. That is true democracy, as distinct from a democracy where people and the ruled are a million miles away from each other. Therefore, my main hope would be that there has been successful decentralized governance in the state of Kerala, that if we can perhaps kindle a hope that such forms of decentralized governance will spread in the country, then we have the possibility that from that ground level accountability, there will be a percolation up to higher levels of governance. That is what I call an institutionalized civic consciousness, not in exhortation for moral consciousness, but in institutionalized civic consciousness. That is my only way forward. Absent that, we will continue to see a recurrence of the Ghazipur fires and the Yamuna not being cleaned, and all these problems not being solved for years and years.
In what you have identified are the basic principles of good governance, inclusivity, as well as participation, and that will come essentially from bottom-up government. Your book, I want to repeat, is not just a critique of India's development plan, but it is also a pretty good history of India's political economy, and I will recommend a lot of people to read it. I noticed that you have a very beautiful relationship with your father. As someone who lost his father early, I'm quite enviable. But I agree with what your father says about you. You will always be an Indian at heart. And I think this book is your love letter to India. And I hope people read it with that in mind, that it is out of deep concern for your country for your former country that you wrote this book. So, Dr. Mody, thank you very much for joining me on Khanversations and enlightening us so much about India and India's economy. But there are also insights that other countries can also benefit from your book. And so, to the audience, please look at all the links that I will be posting, and please subscribe to Khanversations, like the video, press the bell icon. And as you realize, this is an incredible conversation about India's development, India's economy, India's past, as well as India's future. So please make sure that you share it with as many people as you can. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the conversation and the care you have taken to read my book and ask all these very fantastic questions.
Thank you.